Bonjour tout le monde. Saigo. This is a session of the MISC annual conference, which is our 25th anniversary conference. And this session is about Canada's place in the world. This is a bilingual event and simultaneous translation is available if you click on the icon at the bottom right of your screen. It's the interpretation icon. And then you can select your language, either English or French. You can also, if you don't select any language, you will hear what people are saying directly, obviously, in the language they are speaking. La traduction simultanée est disponible aujourd'hui. Il suffit d'appuyer sur l'icône interprétation qui est située en bas à droite de votre écran. Et donc, vous utilisez cette fonction pour sélectionner la langue de votre choix. Je suis maintenant prêt à vous présenter notre modératrice pour cette table ronde, Laurie Turnbull. Laurie is the director of the School of Public Administration and an associate professor of political science at Dalhousie University. From 2015 until 2017, she was on secondment to the Privy Council Office, first as policy advisor to the Machinery of Government Secretariat, then as departmental liaison to the Office of the Minister of Democratic Institutions, and finally as the policy advisors at the Priorities and Planning Secretariat. Dr. Turnbull's research and teaching focus on parliamentary democracy and governance, public sector ethics, and democratic reform. She has taught political science and public administration at Dalhousie, Queen's, Carleton, and Acadia universities. Her book, Democratizing the Constitution, Reforming Responsible Government, co-authored with Mark Jarvis and the late Peter Aucoin, won the Donor Prize in 2011 and the Donald Smiley Prize in 2012. So, merci beaucoup, Laurie, pour votre présence aujourd'hui, et c'est à vous.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And hello, everyone, and welcome. So my name is Laurie Turnbull, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's panel on Canada's place in the world. So I'm going to begin by introducing and thanking very much our panelists in advance who have joined us to lend their invaluable perspectives to the conversation. So we're going to, once I introduce them, we're going to hear brief remarks from each panelist, and then I'll ask them some questions. So first, Bruce Heyman is the co-founder of Uncharted LLC and the co-author of The Art of Diplomacy, Strengthening the Canada-US Relationship in Times of Uncertainty, which highlights the extraordinary country of Canada and takes an in-depth look at why diplomacy matters now more than ever. Most recently, he served as the United States Ambassador to Canada under President Barack Obama from 2014 until 2017. He continues his work strengthening the relationship between Canada and the United States by serving as a strategic advisor to Canada 2020, a Canadian progressive think tank based in Ottawa, as a member of the advisory board to the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center, and as an honorary patron to the Council of the Great Lakes region. He is also on the advisory board for Uptake in Chicago. So welcome, Bruce, and thank you so much for being here with us.
It's a pleasure.
Vicki Heyman is also the co-founder of Uncharted LLC and the co-author of The Art of Diplomacy, Strengthening the Canada-US Relationship in Times of Uncertainty. Vicki serves on the board of Chicago Media Project and the Council for Canadian-American Relations, and is a member of the International Advisory Board of C2 Montreal. Before launching Uncharted, Vicki spent 3 years as an American cultural envoy in Ottawa, leading cross-border conversations and programs related to the arts, social innovation, and youth engagement. Her most powerful work there involved partnering with the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa and the State Department's Art in Embassies program to launch the seminal Contemporary Conversations speaking series at the National Gallery of Canada, to use art to craft discussions on each issue, such as social justice, the environment, and identity. Vicki, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Professor Roland Paris is a professor of international affairs and the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He's an associate fellow of Chatham House and former senior advisor on global affairs and defense to the Prime Minister of Canada. Currently, he is a member of the Advisory Council to the Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, a fellow of the Halifax International Security Forum, and chairperson of the jury for the Canadian Foreign Service Officer Awards. So welcome, Roland. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give each of the panelists 5 to 7 minutes to give us some opening comments. And so I think I'll go in the order that we started here today. And so Bruce, I'll ask you to kick us off.
So first of all, thank you. Thank everyone who is taking time out of their busy day to attend this conversation, a conversation that Vicki and I have grown to love to participate in, and that is the role of Canada in the world and the importance of it. Strange as it is, you have a former US ambassador and partner here to give you that perspective, but the impact that Canada had on us during our time serving our country in, and I say Ottawa, but in all reality, we traveled to every province, every territory, small towns, large cities, met people from all walks of Canadian life, and left with this profound love of your incredibly beautiful and diverse country. I'm going to say some things that you all know so well, but sometimes maybe hearing it from somebody from the other side of the border is worthwhile. So you have the second largest landmass country in the world with incredible number of resources that will be so important to the world and to your community going forward as we enter this changing world, which I'm sure the professor and Vicki and I will chat about here. You have an incredibly highly educated population and really a wealthy population, one of the wealthiest. You're a participant in these international forums that I think have been very important to you over an incredible long period of time. But the most important thing from an American perspective is that you're our neighbor and our next door neighbor to the north. And the way we have always looked at it isn't you and me, it is we. And what kinds of things we can do together to both impact our neighborhood, but also the world at large. And these are the kinds of things that we're going to face and have conversations about going forward. But this is the way that we, as teammates, as partners, as allies, as business partners, as friends, and as next door neighbors have participated in over a great many years together. If the United States could close its eyes and re-choose looking around the world, who would be our best neighbor to the north? You know what? There would be no better neighbor than the one we have. And so we're pretty darn lucky at that. But the path ahead is a bit uncertain. And one of the areas that I'd like to address today in further comments and conversations, which you'll see, is the most important path for Canada going forward may be as a result of the path that the US democracy goes down over these next few years. We're being very much tested, and you think we were tested with the Trump administration, and that's behind us. I'm here to tell you it's not behind us, and the threat to American democracy is significant. And if American democracy is under threat, that threat will impose significant complications for Canada in its positioning in North America and in the world, which we'll address. But I am an optimist, and I believe that even with all the challenges our country has faced historically, we've overcome them and we've come out stronger and better. But that doesn't mean it won't be painful to get through the process that we're currently on. So I'm here with deep appreciation and thankful to be able to have this conversation with all of you. And I hope to learn as much as maybe I impart a little bit, but I'm humbled to be here with all of you today.
Thank you so much. That's already a lot to think about. Vicki, can I turn it to you?
Sure. So again, echoing Bruce, it's just wonderful to be here with you virtually, and also exciting to be here in Canada, because that's actually where we are right now. And it was our first trip since COVID back for an extended period. So we've had an extraordinary time. We spent a little time in Toronto, a little time in Ottawa, and now here in Montreal. I'm going to be a little bit different kind of panelist today, I believe, sitting between Bruce and Roland. I'm going to talk to you about my passion and kind of my perspective as it relates to the value and the importance of culture in diplomacy. During my tenure and time here in Canada, I had the extraordinary experience, as Bruce mentioned, to travel your country from sea to sea to sea. We were on the road for about 18 months of our 3-year time period. And my opportunity really was to focus on meeting social innovators, artists, entrepreneurs who really used culture and art as a primary dialogue and way to really get to the heart of matters that go beyond diplomacy, issues around racism, diversity, our environment, assimilation, isolation, Indigenous issues. And during my tenure in Canada, we created a conversation series called Contemporary Conversations, where we let artists lead the way through their art, whether it's film, art, conversation, innovation, to talk about in a very open and candid manner these really important, essential issues. So for me, being here today and being here the last 10 days has really just been a continuation of the work and intention that has been a big part of my life really since inception. And the work of culture and the work of connecting through culture really has never ended in terms of Bruce's and my role while we were in Canada and post-Canada. We feel that through this way of presenting essential dialogue, we can really stay connected and deepen our understanding of each other on a personal level, but also as our countries. And as Bruce mentioned, looking forward into the future in the role of the US and Canada as partners, as allies, and in the world, I feel that art and culture is one of the primary languages in which we can use, the primary languages and methodologies that we can use to bring ourselves closer in a much more transparent and open way to solve some of our looming challenges. So I look forward to the dialogue today and look forward to kind of putting on that lens and looking through that lens and challenging each of us to think outside the box and how we might not go to traditional solutions to solve our problems, but maybe some non-traditional person-to-person solutions.
Thank you so much. That is such a refreshing, interesting perspective. I love that. Thank you. Roland.
Well, thank you, Laurie, for hosting this. Je veux également remercier Daniel Bellon et l'Institut d'études canadiennes. C'est un grand plaisir de participer à cette conférence aujourd'hui, and also an honor to be on this panel with my fellow panelists. As you've already heard, they not only represented their country with distinction, but came to truly appreciate Canada. And I think that Canadians can appreciate Bruce and Vicky Hayman's enthusiasm for our country as well. Now, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer in this discussion, but I think that there are some pretty sobering conditions internationally that Canada is needing to face. And Bruce was hinting at this a bit with regard to the challenges that the United States continues to work through. Of course, there are urgent present priorities, managing the pandemic and the economic effects of the pandemic. And Canada and most of our partner countries are fairly domestically focused these days, not surprisingly, considering the public health emergency that we're all confronting. The international dimensions of these current crises are also important, and the G20 meeting that's beginning in Rome now, will be addressing aspects of that crisis as well. But what I would like to underscore are the more longer term, or you might even call them structural shifts that are taking place in the world as it affects Canada. And it does have implications for Canadian foreign policy. And of course, one of the biggest shifts, maybe the one that is the defining feature of international affairs in the early part of this century, and maybe for many years, if not decades to come, is the dramatic and very quick shift in global power that we've seen, particularly with China and the rise of the Indo-Pacific as an economic power in the world, and increasingly with the capacity to be a military power, and certainly becoming more influential in international politics. Now, the diffusion of power away from what had been the Western core of the international system and the unipolar moment with the United States as an unrivaled power at the end of the Cold War, it's not entirely a bad thing in the sense that there are many other parts of the world that have and are gaining voice that they didn't have before. But it is simultaneously allowing authoritarian countries to gain influence and to target the very openness of our own country. So, we have been subjecting Canada to the targeted retaliation by authoritarian countries, and all of the Western liberal democratic countries, and not just Western ones, are now facing new kinds of challenges of disruption of their own domestic politics from outside. It's also led to a weakening in that sprawling system of rules and institutions at the international level that Canadians have relied upon for generations to maintain a largely open and a relatively stable international system, which is, of course, a particular challenge for a country like Canada, which has been so committed to trying to build and sustain and renovate that system. And that's connected to another challenge, which is the one that Bruce was mentioning, which is America's own domestic political challenges. Donald Trump's election was a wake-up call to Canadians, to many people in the world, about the assumptions that we've taken for granted for so long in our international policy. And it's not so much Trump himself, it's what he personified, a kind of aggressive nativism and anti-internationalism that portrayed the very international system the United States had built as hostile to the United States. Now, that's clearly not Joe Biden. But everyone can read American newspapers, everyone can read American opinion polls, and Donald Trump owns the Republican Party. He's almost certainly going to try and run for office again. And if it's him or somebody like him, we're in for another very rocky ride. But even if that doesn't come to pass, what we're seeing is a steady drift towards economic protectionism in the United States, which it opens up a whole, a category of discussion that we might want to pursue. So there are many other changes taking place. The net result here is that we are living in a different world. It's a world in which our principal partner remains our closest friend and our closest ally, but with an asterisk. Less predictable, maybe less reliable. It's a world in which authoritarian countries have targeted Canada directly, in which major power rivalry has definitively returned. It's a world of incredibly rapid change. That there's a quote that I don't know if this was Lenin or whether it's been mistakenly attributed to Lenin, but he said, but the quote is that there are decades in which almost nothing happens, and there are weeks in which decades happen. Well, it seems like we've been living through a whole bunch of weeks in which decades happen. And in the end, because of all these changes and new challenges facing Canada, we're just going to have to work that much harder to maintain the relationships and to maintain the kind of conditions that we have, I think, taken for granted for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you to all three panelists for giving us such a rich introduction. I think we've situated really well a conversation about Canada and the US, and also the broader global context, which itself is shifting so much. It's not just that Canada's role in the world is changing, it's that the world is changing too. So I'm hanging on each of your every word. So I'm going to stop talking here, and we're going to get to a bit more of a question and answer, but I'm going to pose the first question first to Vicky, and then if there's time, and I'll let other people tell me that, others can jump in as well. So Vicky, if I can start with you. When you think about Canada's place in the world, let's look back a little bit before we turn to the future, even the present and the future. How would you reflect on the past 25 years? What would you say have been the key events, times that our approach has shifted, for better or for worse? yeah, I'll leave that to you.
Sure. So I think I'll focus for me, my perceptions, and really, I guess it's the last half a decade or 8 or so years. I think about, we started studying deeply Canada prior to arriving here. So in 2013, we're now almost 2022. So it's almost a decade, which it's hard to believe. And I think about my perceptions coming to Canada and then my realizations of kind of what I found. So when I arrived in Canada, I found an extraordinarily reliable partner. I found a country that shared our democratic ideals. I found a country that was leaning, well, particularly in the latter part of our tenure and into the present, really leaning in to leading on climate. A country that cared deeply about personal freedom and liberty. And I found a country with a lot of heart and compassion. I found a country that was very welcoming to immigrants and found a way to assimilate those immigrants in really the most kind and the most kind way. I found a country that's very highly educated, extreme highly literacy rate, an opportunity to attend university in a really expansive way, the cost of university being accessible for most Canadians. I found a country where healthcare was provided, irrespective of your job affiliation, a place that people could feel comfortable that their healthcare was not the deciding factor about what they did for day to day in their work, but it was a support system that allowed them to explore various avenues. I found a country that was leaning into science and technology, making advancements in AI and in other kinds of technological and scientific ways. I found a people that have a lot of strength, who had a great reverence for their land, and also had a great deal of humility in the way that they stood in the world. I also went on a whole discovery about indigeneity and the way in the history of Indigenous peoples across both of our lands. I learned about my own history, about my own Indigenous peoples, really through spending time in Canada. I witnessed the Truth and Reconciliation conversations and the pre and the kind of the post Truth and Reconciliation. I felt that Canada is a place that has been extraordinarily looked at the arts and took the arts seriously as a way of expressing themselves and a way of connecting. The great investment that Canada has made in the arts on a percentage of population, a percentage of budget, far and in excess of kind of the seriousness in which we take it at home. So generally, kind of looking back, I would say that, I had these perceptions as an American coming to Canada. I would find my best friend, a beautiful country, but never really, until I spent my time here, never really understanding the depth and the history and kind of the long-standing connections that we, that we have. So for me, I think, what I found, the connective tissue and the connective fiber for our two countries is, our land, our border, the natural resources that kind of flow between our lands. Our peoples, our Indigenous peoples are certainly, connected and continue to be. So our quest for maintaining and sustaining democracy and really an abiding friendship. So from a general perspective, that's really the way that I, saw Canada and the way I continue to see Canada, and really want to shout it from the mountaintops at home. And I feel also that, there's so many things that you lead on. And I just, want to open my arms and say, just lean in, because we need you and the world needs you. And I remember when President Obama, which was a big landmark time for us during our tenure, when, President Obama came to speak to Parliament, and we were filled in Ottawa, the Parliament was filled and burgeoning with people. And he turned to the audience and he said, the world needs more Canada. And so I'll lean in there saying that, your approach to multilateralism, your approach to galvanizing your friends across the world is needed now more than ever, as the United States, certainly under Donald Trump, really became extremely isolationist. And now, even in the tenure of Biden, us really focusing inward, which we can get into another conversation later, on all the existing problems domestically that we have within the psyche of our American populace.
Thank you for that. I remember that day in Ottawa when President Obama came to visit. That was a wonderfully rich moment in Canada-US relations, it seemed to me. The whole city was just happy. You know, it seemed you could feel it. It was great.
I refer to that time as I often refer to that time as like our Camelot moment between our two countries. It just felt like we were kind of enveloped in this one big blanket under a huge hug. It was great.
It was lovely. It was magic. And he was so aware of what was going on and just made the whole thing feel so warm. It was lovely. Roland, can I come to you?
Yeah, well, that meant that the president was well briefed. So congratulations to Bruce and Vicky. Your question was about change in the last couple of decades. And I think that I talked a little bit already about how some of the context has been changing. If the question is, how has Canada's foreign policy changed and practice of foreign policy, I would say actually not that much. Canada continues to practice the kind of liberal, broadly speaking, liberal internationalist approach that has dominated Canadian foreign policy for the last, basically since the end of the Second World War. What happened was everything else changed. And then it seemed like Canada was a kind of an outlier with a few other countries still embracing this kind of vision. Now, it continues to be a driving force for Canadian foreign policy. I happened to get a copy of the speech that Justin Trudeau gave earlier today in the Parliament in the Netherlands. A journalist sent it to me, soliciting comment. And I read it and I was actually struck. You can read politicians' speeches and sometimes they are less remarkable than at other times. And this was actually an excellent speech articulating, in effect, the idea of Canada's approach in this world. But it's still committed to the same values and largely committed to the same kind of methods. Now, there's a downside to this, I think, which is that until recently that we have to some extent been coasting, kind of believing a little bit too much our own press. There's good reasons for Canada to have a good reputation internationally, and it's not wrong to believe that Canada has a good reputation, but it can encourage complacency. And the world has changed a lot, and our adjustment to that world is still just beginning. And it's not just a matter of how we strategically adjust to this new world. And I would note that in the Liberal campaign platform, there was a commitment to produce and implement a comprehensive Indo-Pacific strategy, which is important. But it's not just the strategy, it's also the investment in the instruments. And that includes our diplomatic service, it includes our development budget, and it includes our military. We're going to need these instruments in order to do what I was talking about earlier, which is working harder to be able to get the things that we've taken for granted for a while. I think there's a growing recognition now that we can't afford to treat foreign policy like a kind of optional luxury. And because if we don't get ahead of this and think strategically about how Canada is positioned, we're going to be subject to these changes anyway. So it would be better for us to be anticipating them and getting ahead of them.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's an interesting time for us to be having this conversation today, in particular, this week in particular, given the Prime Minister's, his agenda and what he's doing for the next few days on Canada's behalf. Bruce, can I come to you just for a bit of a look over the past couple of decades to see where we've come from?
Well, we've touched on a lot here, and I thought I'd add just a few things in the U.S. context, and that would be the importance of what NAFTA brought. And this agreement, which was groundbreaking when it was first signed, and I think, kudos to everybody who worked on it for its most current revisions and updates. I think that this brought us collectively linked together in a way that we weren't previously linked. Maybe people can look at the Auto Pact or some other things to say we were, but I think this more formalized it and continued to more formalize our relationship on a commerce basis, but also updating it now currently. I think this is really important. And I'm going to say it's important for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to riff a little bit off of both Vicky and Roland. So if you think about this in the business world, for those of you who studied business and gone off to business school, you'll recognize the old, we got to sit down. If you have a company, what's your vision? What's your mission? What are your strategy? What are your tactics? What are your goals? And, looking at, key performance indicators and, did you achieve all that? And unfortunately, so many times, whether you're a company or whether you're a government, you jump right into tactics. And sometimes I think social media and media today force governments to think more tactically than strategically because you don't have the luxury of time. And the US-Canada relationship in particular is filled with a lot of what I would call irritants. And I don't mean to minimize them. I once got myself in trouble for minimizing an irritant. It's not minimizing them at all. But it doesn't define the overall relationship. But sometimes they suck so much air out of the room and they force leaders and they force ambassadors to dive right in to focus on some of these tactical micro things. And we're missing this larger message. And so let's just think back for the last few years on the tactics that were deployed and what that means for Canada and for the US and more broadly the world in terms of implementation of strategy and goals. And that is Donald Trump threatened Canada's auto industry. He put tariffs on your steel and aluminum to try to squeeze you on NAFTA. He threatened you on N95 masks. He withheld vaccinations, even though there was a deal done. There was a threat even at one point on troops at the border. I mean, given the way that this interaction was taking place, and you think about the meeting that was held in Quebec where he came late, left early, and the voices that were coming out of the White House, I will tell you that now is the time that we should step back a minute and recognize that these things can take hold at any point in time and may take a hold at some time in the future. And it's time to come together and to think more strategically about the US-Canada relationship. And how do we codify that and bring that together and recognize the importance of we? All of a sudden, it was this recognition that, wow, the N95 mask, but wait, the nurses coming in from Windsor were saving patients in Detroit, and components on this mask were made in Western Canada. And a carburetor crosses the border 10 times before it's actually, completed. And all of these various things, people don't recognize that. And I think this is a good time with a new government now established in Canada, with a presidency that will be in place for a while, that this is a time to maybe let's do some larger strategic things. That doesn't mean you ignore some of the tactical challenges that we face, that the media is going to highlight everything from a pipeline to milk to Buy America to all of these various things that will exist. And again, I'm not minimizing them, but I am saying that we do have a unique opportunity with two governments now to dive in on a roadmap to more strategic alliances and codify that at this point in time.
Yeah, thank you all three of you so much for that. And the whole time that you were all reflecting, I kept thinking, we're talking about over the past couple of decades, events, some that we can control, some that we can't, that have an effect of disrupting or sort of reconfiguring realities, and how we respond to that, the importance of taking time to think, which I think we don't always have that luxury. And there's more emphasis on the reaction, the speed of the reaction, as opposed to the thought and taking one's time. And it all made me think of the importance of leadership. And obviously we've seen shifts in that on the US side. And in Canada, over the past couple of course we have, we've seen leadership change, and whether that creates a big change in how foreign policy is practiced, depends on where you are. But I wanted to bring a question to Roland first and then expand it out. As we know, this week we've seen a new federal cabinet sworn in. It's kind of a new cabinet in the sense that it's going to set up Prime Minister Trudeau's third mandate. It's also a very familiar cabinet in the sense that most of the faces around that table we have known before. Many have switched portfolios, including Minister Joly, who is now going to be, I think it's the fifth of Prime Minister Trudeau's foreign affairs ministers. So kind of a question about that, about the implications of switching leadership in that role, but also, if you feel comfortable, a question about leadership more broadly and what's needed here and how much it matters, who are the people who are occupying these roles, and what do they bring to the challenges we face?
Good questions. I mean, it does matter a lot, the personalities and the attributes of the people who occupy these roles. Minister Joly is energetic. She's bright. She has a bit of background on international affairs. Remember, most foreign ministers in this country start that job with little or no background in international affairs. So I'm sure that she'll throw herself into this task and that she will hit the ground running. There is an issue with as you said, 5 foreign ministers in 6 years. And if you broaden that out to the last 15 years, it's 11 foreign ministers in 15 years. I think that's the simple, frequency of that rotation itself is a bit of a problem. It is a position by its nature that benefits from more continuity than that, not only because the foreign minister needs to learn a whole lot of, in many cases, complicated files and get a handle on them, but also because the foreign minister needs to build international relationships. And, one of the first things that Minister Joly is going to need to do is hopefully get to Washington and start building a relationship with her counterpart, Secretary Blinken and others in the US administration, but do the same with key partners around the world. And if we're asking the foreign minister, as I mentioned, the Liberal campaign platform does, if we're asking the foreign minister to play a leading role in leading a strategic exercise, you can't do that if you're having a foreign minister change every year or so. So I think that it's worth thinking about, what kind of continuity is needed in order to be able to allow the occupants of that position to have the conditions for success. Having said that, I think, as I mentioned, I'm sure that she's bright, she's capable, energetic, and she's going to tackle this task. And she has a few key challenges. One is, as I mentioned, the United States, and there I agree with Bruce about the possibility of cooperating in a larger way. There is this new roadmap for relations. Canada has proposed something called a battery alliance, which is effectively a kind of code for let's make sure that the development of electric vehicles and the parts going into electric vehicles, including the batteries, that's done in an integrated North American way. Let's think more broadly about clean innovation in a Canada-US North American way. I would love to see that come to pass. Of course, the challenge now is that the Democratic-led Congress is playing around with the idea of a credit for US consumers buying electric vehicles, which would give the credit only for vehicles that were made and assembled in the United States, which is contradictory to the new NAFTA. It's contradictory to the spirit of our cooperation in this industry since 1964. It's contradictory to US trade regulations, and it's a reflection of a new protectionism. So I'm sure that we'll be able to manage this. But managing these kinds of crises when they pop up is quite different from moving ahead with a positive agenda. And then just very briefly for the foreign minister, she's going to have to play a significant role leading the development and release and implementation of this promised Indo-Pacific strategy. And the other element that's in the campaign platform, and there wasn't much on foreign affairs, was talking about human rights and democracy as being treated as a core strategic priority for Canada, and she'll have to breathe life into that commitment.
Thank you. Vicky, can I come to you on this question as well?
Yes, and I'm when I saw the announcement about Minister Jolie, actually, I was pretty delighted because I think we share so much in terms of the way in which we see culture as a bridge building device. I mean, as you know, she was first the Minister of Culture, and I think I got to know Minister Jolie very well during our tenure in Ottawa. She is bright, she is resourceful, she has a toolbox. It looks different than the traditional folks that you might think would occupy that role. And I think that toolbox goes very deep and goes very much to the people. And I think she really will recognize the how to use these tools in cultural diplomacy, utilizing cultural diplomacy as a really great vehicle for her as well. I think about the way in which we have this opportunity to think about a new way of communicating, a new way of working, a way to use our cultural and social innovation institutions and structures to really think about how do we bridge our divides. And I've thought a lot about, myself, about how do you create dialogue and community through cultural institutions like the National Gallery of Canada and the Smithsonian or the National Gallery in Washington. How do we think about using film, a film like Anthropocene, which just traveled originated in Canada, traveled the United States, all over the world, a Canadian homegrown cultural device to really get deep into the ideas about culture. And I think it's a way of a minister having a toolbox, a way of not just telling, but showing art, showing voices, showing what the people think about the country and the continent and the world in which they live. And I think also kind of about the new structures in communication and the way in which, we are in these times of very shifting grounds. And we think about the way in which people are working post-COVID has totally changed. We become more and more less confined to a workspace and less confined to borders in terms of the projects we work on and the way that we work. So I think, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs and just as a new cabinet, to think about these new structures that have been handed to us and how do we optimize those. And Canada is so well positioned in that space. And I think the other idea about harnessing the creativity of the digital space, whether it is social media platforms, which are now aging very rapidly, and we're talking about the metaverse and the way that we virtually are going to be connected to each other in a much more meaningful way. I think leadership that can see what the world will really look like, not just today and tomorrow with all the looming challenges, but what is the world going to look like? How are we going to communicate, and how are we going to touch each other over the next five, maybe 3, it may be 5. I mean, as Roland said, COVID accelerated us. We don't know if it was a day or 25 years that we experienced in the last 2 years. And we did have some time. We were forced to step back and is forced to think, but I think to more closely be catapulted into these other paradigms. So, going back to the cabinet that the Prime Minister has put together, going back to Minister Jolie, I think that these folks are well positioned to think about, what's coming next. And that doesn't take away from, which we can talk more about, some of the short-term political challenges and economic challenges that are on the landscape. But I think keeping the eye on these larger, grander, bigger ideas and getting in front of it is a place that Canada can really shine.
Thank you. Bruce, please, if you want to weigh in on Minister Jolie and leadership more broadly, would be great.
Well, I just will reiterate what everybody has said, but I remember a conversation that we had early on to understand Secretary of State Clinton's approach when she was traveling around the world. And she talked very deeply about culinary diplomacy. And you sat down and said, what do you mean? Well, I said, well, if you sat down for a meal across from somebody, you can sure work through so many of the challenges and issues. And it's about personality and building relationships. You should never underestimate the value of two political leaders at any level. If they can create a personal relationship, their ability to work through challenges. And if they don't have a personal relationship, how that then becomes an impediment to just working through things. Even though on a piece of paper, everything seems to make sense, when you have a personal relationship, the impossible can be possible. And in our experience early on, working with the minister, who will now be handed a very large international portfolio, Minister Jolie has that ability to develop and connect and develop really strong personal ties and relationships that she can utilize that skill set to her advantage and for your country's advantage going forward.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions in the time that we have left. So Vicki, I'm going to come to you first on this one. As we've been speaking about, we've covered some of this already. This is a particularly critical time in the Canada-US relationship. And so kind of thinking about all the things we're working on in terms of economic growth, job creation, climate change, there's so many things that will require a strong partnership. And we seem to be just looking, like we are just at that point. We are at a critical point and all of these things and more. So I wonder if you could talk about sort of next steps, because it's huge to think about. But if we started thinking about like really mapping it out, what do we need to do now in the next 6 months, in the next year, to situate ourselves for success and strong partnerships on these things?
So I think, we don't know what's going to be hitting us in the next 6 months. We have a lot of things pending in the United States that can take things in one direction or another. In terms of what's pending in Congress, whether it be in some of these large infrastructure bills, on this voter protection bill, which is critically important to democracy in our country. And I think as an exemplar for democracy worldwide, we're in the midst of the pandemic. We don't know, are we in the 7th inning? Are we in the 5th inning? Are we in the 8th inning? Or maybe we're in the 9th inning. So we don't really know where we're going on that. Are we going back to isolation, to remote working? Are we going to be able to progress? I think all we can really do is like kind of deal with the knowns. We know that in the economic environment that it's very important that we are focused on new technologies, whether it be in healthcare, in climate, in thinking about how do we establish, how would Canada establish itself as and continue to establish itself as a leader, not only in voice, but in industry and follow through. We talked a lot about remote work and the way in which we can become more borderless in the way we work. If we think about, opportunities where thought leadership or Canadian technology can be plugged in across border for American or vice versa, American to Canadian companies. I think the Prime Minister now has this brand new cabinet. He's been given an extra, period of time in his tenure, and I think he can really enter the G20 from a position of strength. He's one of the most tenured leaders in the G20 right now in terms of his time there. And I think by just kind of leading into all the things that you're doing right. We come here to this country and we see civility, we see respect for each other, we see resettlement for refugees that have been turned away other places. And I think it's utilizing all your tools to just continue to send that out into the atmosphere and let people continue to leading by example, because I do feel that we in the United States do see Canada as the leader in so many of these spaces. We wrestle with gun control in our country. Violence is at an all-time high. We have these really huge racial tensions going on in our country right now. And I think, we look at, I know there's always work to be done, but we look at the work that's been started in your country with truth and reconciliation and how that might be a model for our country. So in the very short period of time, I would say continue to lean in and stand on all of the building blocks that you have already established, and just know and own the fact that the rest of the world sees you in this very positive leadership light. So I think for in terms of what I would say next time is for the next 6 months would just be building on what you have done. And in terms of specifics, in terms of the next 6 months, it's a pretty short time horizon, but as you know, in the next 6 months, we're going to start reshifting things down in the United States as we start to think about the midterm elections and elections coming up, and there'll be some posturing around that. And I mean, Bruce, you might want to take it from there on that front, but yeah.
Great.
Well,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Vicky.
Well, look, to go to paraphrase maybe a little bit of how Darwin thought of things, and it wasn't the strongest that survived, and it wasn't necessarily the smartest, but those that are more adaptable to change. And we are in an incredible period of change. And I would say this to Canadians and Americans alike, that don't get stuck in your old way of things. Just say, this is the way we used to do it. Well, that's fine. That's fine. But the world may present itself and the opportunities present itself that the way we used to do it isn't the right way any longer. And if COVID didn't teach us that, I don't know what would, because we learned again that doing things that were impossible are now possible. Who would have thought we would run all of our economies the way we ran them in a remote environment the way we did? I would have said that that's completely impossible. And yet the human nature is that we adapt pretty well. But I would also say, don't go slow. This is, things are moving very fast, and to establish your competitive advantage and to be there, study it, research it, make a decision, and act. You've got to go and move, because
Come out of the gate
you
fast.
You've got to come fast. You can't, because things are moving really fast. I will say, as I think about Canada in this new world that we've now just entered into, it used to be so much about where you're located to do your job, to run your company, to run a factory, do the things that we're talking about. And now, more and more in developed nations, we realize that that's not the case. But the world is so small with the ability of technology that you could have tons of the smartest and best people in the whole wide world all located in Canada and communicating with the entire world, doing the jobs that they need to do, and yet have this balance of wonderful life. And I think you have a sales job to do. You have the space and capabilities of being a larger country than you currently are. And this may be your another moment, a unique opportunity to really, looking how immigration and people flows and things are happening around the world. I would say that's something that Canada should not look at. You can look at it, and you are doing it incrementally, but this is a time where you need to look at those kinds of things, that you're willing to do leaps, not steps.
Thank you very much. And Roland, will come to you for this as well.
Well, I can't remember what your question was,
Oh,
Lori.
I was thinking that. Yeah, I know. This one was about sort of short to medium term. Canada's relationship with the US, how we try to hit the ground running
I'll
on
give
the
a
challenges.
very, very brief answer, because we've talked a lot about the US so far. But I mean, Canada's perennial challenge is to avoid becoming collateral damage in economic measures that are not actually meant to target Canada, but that we're just kind of, captured up in almost unintentionally, maybe intentionally in some cases. So, we need to, at a moment when the United States is, for both national security reasons and for reasons of domestic economic thinking, increasing some of its trade barriers and trying to reshore a certain supply chains. We need to continue working to persuade our friends and people in positions of influence at all levels of the US political system and in industry that Canada and the United States are together in this, that it's an integrated continental economic platform, and that applies to what we were talking about before, which is the emerging electric vehicle industry. But beyond that, I think there are ways that Canada can look to cooperate, particularly with the Biden administration, both on these energy and environmental issues, on a whole range of global issues where the two administrations have similar views on a lot of issues, but even in the neighborhood, say, in relation to the struggles of Central American countries that are dealing with these enormous governance problems and economic problems, and that are the source countries for a lot of desperate people who are leaving those countries, moving their way into Mexico and towards the US border. Canada can help more in Central America to try to improve the conditions. We have a long-standing partnership in the Americas more generally, and that's something that Canada and the United States can do more of. But there are challenges, there are opportunities like always, but the prospect of a Trump return is nightmarish.
Yeah. I was thinking, responding to what Roland was thinking about. I mean, I think when you think about the upcoming election and where we are with our combativeness and kind of the stalling in Congress, I think when Canada thinks about positioning itself diplomatically, any wins that Canada can give to this administration obviously will help them. When you think about one of our big problems, and actually the vice president's platform right now is really working on the southern border, and we have problems kind of popping up. It's like whack-a-mole at home, whether it's guns, whether it's the border, whether it's COVID, whether it's, these issues of democracy and tensions and struggles with the polarization of our people. Targeting in on strategically on some of these wins and some of the economic win-win situations, wins for Canada and wins for the United States. I remember also when one of Prime Minister Trudeau's tactics with Trump when he became president was really going directly to governors and working with them as it related to NAFTA and getting things moving forward. I mean, these governors are all having races too, and they're all scared to death and trying to figure out how they keep their jobs, and the senators. So I think, you can also think about working not only federal to federal, but also federal to state, and just look for these little, these little opportunities. And I think that can be a way of kind of navigating the waters over the next couple of years. I mean, being Americans and living in our own country, we day to day are just, kind of like, what's coming next? Where are we going? It feels very, in terms of the forward-looking election landscape, it's really not clear where, where we're heading, particularly in the midterms. So.
Thank you all for your answer to that question. I'm going to throw one more at you, and I'm going to start with Bruce, please. And I'm going to change the geographical concentration of this question. I'm going to focus a bit wider. I wonder if I can ask your impressions on how Canada's role in the world is affected specifically by our relationship with China. Mm-hmm. And of course, this has been a very eventful one over the past couple of years, specifically with, a number of things, but one of which being the situation with the two Michaels. And their release, I think, very recently has created a conversation and a sense of uncertainty around what is next and where do we go from here. And so I am so interested in what all of you have to say about this. So I'm going to stop talking now, and Bruce, let me come to you first.
So you have a country with 1.4 billion people. It's now the second largest economy on the planet Earth. They are moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into middle-class life. And they've been around, if you add the time length that the US and Canada have been around as countries, add them together, and then you can add maybe thousands of years to the fact that China has been on the planet Earth in one form or another, maybe not exactly this form of government, but in one form or another, they've been here for an incredibly long period of time. And thus, they also have very long perspective. I think that, this is an incredibly complicated issue, but one in which we have to recognize that we're going to have to work with China. And they're going to be here, they're not going away. And so the original conversation, which got a lot of attention from the US side, where Secretary Blinken met with counterparts in Alaska, they tried to lay out the relationship in very specific terms. And they said, cooperate, compete, and in those areas that we need to confront, we'll confront. Now, for most of the rest of the world, confrontation is not a good outcome. It's an outcome that we would be last go to. That being said, I understand why the US laid that out. But for Canada and for the rest of the world, primarily, I would look for those first 2 points as to be areas to work together. But the complications of it obviously are that Canada, as an ally of the United States, as a partner to carry water in NATO and in the UN and other places, will be expected to do things from a US perspective that, may sometimes challenge Canada in terms of its approach that it wants to take. And those are the difficulties that one faces when you face this multilateral world and creating these alliances. That being said, we have the number one problem, and this week is a highlight of that week, and that is climate change. The number one problem facing the world, as we all know it all globally together, is the fact that we have a climate problem. And we're not going to solve that problem without working together with China. And we've got to figure out how best to do that. And it creates a great opportunity, I think, for Canada, Canadian businesses, and the like to find pathways to build bridges, which is what Canada's known to do, even in light of the most difficult set of circumstances for these two men, the two Michaels, and the circumstances that you've just gone through. But we've got to look forward and find pathways to doing that. And I would say in the climate world, and investing in appropriate ways might be a particular pathway for you guys to work together. In addition, you have food, and you provide a lot of resources that can be utilized and important with your relationship there. But look, navigating this, is not going to be without, some significant challenges, but they're not going away. And that's the important message. And so we better figure out ways to work together successfully.
Thank you. Can I come to Roland next, please?
Sure. Yeah, it's a vexed issue for Canada, since we've spent the last couple of years dealing with this horrendous hostage-taking situation. And if there was any residual goodwill towards China in this country, it's gone. And no one is going to be forgetting anytime soon the treatment of our two citizens. But that said, I think that Bruce is exactly right, and that some combination of compete, confront, and cooperate, which Canada has its own version of that language, and so does the European Union. There seems to be a kind of movement towards this trying to identify the areas in which China needs to be stopped or confronted or rolled back or resisted. Areas in which China's where there's competition, whether it's in competition in the development of new kinds of products and technologies, for example, and where ideally we need China's cooperation. Bruce mentioned climate change, global public health. I mean, hopefully one of the things coming out of this horrendous pandemic period will be establishing a mechanism for identifying and emerging health crises, communicating the information accurately in a timely way and responding to the emergencies as they develop, and or even other issues like arms control, including conventional arms control, nuclear arms control, and hopefully arms control for new kinds of weapons, cyber weapons and other kinds of weapons. So it's like, China, you can't just ignore the fact that China's there, and for a whole range of global issues, we need to try at least to cooperate. I think it's going to get more difficult to sustain that cooperation with China as the competition becomes more intense. And Canada will obviously need to navigate its own way through the relationship and triangulate also its relations with the United States and with China at the same time. That's going to be its own set of challenges. But I would just conclude with the thought that when the government says that it wants to release an Indo-Pacific strategy or pursue an Indo-Pacific strategy, that's for the region as a whole. And there are lots of opportunities to develop and deepen relationships in that region. If anything, there's a need for Canada to be investing diplomatic and economic and military resources in its relations in that region. And we're starting to move in that direction, but we need to face that imperative much more directly.
Thank you very much. Vicki, I'm going to come to you.
Sure. I mean, I think they, Roland and Bruce have covered it pretty well. I would just probably double down on that idea of partnerships and the multilateral relationship. And I think if you look at over the next year or two, there will be unique opportunities where Canada can become more of a partner and observe and survey the situation, and then really see where they can kind of go in more surgically on one-on-one types of endeavors or relationships. I think kind of not rushing in, but kind of seeing where these partnerships and alliances are shifting and being part of that conversation, integrally part of that would be very, very good. I think also when you think about the way that China has embraced Western culture, I mean, they live by their own sets of standards and rules and government auspices, but yet when you think about how they live their lives, the kind of music they're listening to, the way that Chinese people are dressing, the way that they're doing their living, their homes, the food that they search. You look at the art auction market. The Chinese are driving the contemporary art market right now. They love our culture. So don't forget that tool in our toolbox. And that is something that they want very badly. So as much as they want quote unquote relationships and economic, for them, acceptance in Western culture is a very big part of their ethos, and participation as in participating in Western culture is a very part of their kind of power structural ethos at home. So I think remembering that in our negotiations is also a powerful way of assessing the overall relationship.
Thank you so much. I mean, I don't think I can remember a panel that I learned as much as I did in the past hour and change. And I mean, thank you so much. What a great way to spend part of the afternoon. I appreciate so much. All three of you have such an interesting and unique perspective, and you are, to say you're experts doesn't even cut it. And so the fact that you came to these questions with so much, just upfront, substantive, honest material, you've given the viewers so much to chew on here. And so I really want to thank all three of you for participating and for being so generous with all that you have, or what you have in your brain, because that's absolutely wonderful for everybody to listen to. So thank you, Vicki and Bruce, and thank you, Roland, for your contributions this afternoon.
Anytime.
Thank you,
Thank
Laurie.
you.
Thank you, Laurie.